The Cold War History Fair Documentary by Roberto Lachner. The Cold War has a lot to do with taking a stand, since it was about two ideas fighting for control. The Americans and much of the Western world were fighting for capitalism. Capitalism is a system in which people work to earn money. Free enterprise rules. The Soviet Union, composed of Russia and other Eastern countries, were taking a stand for communism. Communism is a system in which people share essentially everything through government. Both sides strongly believed in their causes, but only one would prevail. Now for some overview on the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't an actual war fought with weapons, it was just a period of political tension after World War II. After the Second World War, the US and USSR expanded their ideologies through war-torn Europe. The Soviets were afraid that the US would eliminate their communist system and vice versa. The US tried to stop the spread of communism by standing up to the Soviets wherever they wanted to spread. This meant rebuilding and enforcing Western Europe. During this whole time, both countries were developing huge nuclear arsenals. This meant that if both countries went to war, it would mean the end of the human race. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries were on the brink of nuclear war. The Soviets had nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, and there was a constant threat of them being launched. Luckily, President Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev reached negotiations, and the nuclear missiles were withdrawn from Cuba. Both countries tried to get others, like Nicaragua, China, Vietnam, and Korea, to change their ideologies. Lots of wars that happened during the Cold War era were based on communist or capitalist control. Examples: Korea and Vietnam. Germany and Berlin were split up into two parts after World War II. East and West. In 1961, the Soviets put up a wall around West Berlin, the Berlin Wall. The wall was up for around 20 to 30 years, separating West Berlin from communist East Berlin. The wall was later torn down, in part because of Ronald Reagan. This was the beginning of the end for the Cold War. The war truly ended after the USSR dissolved. Economic problems and other causes led to the secession of Russia and other countries, ending the war. How did leaders take part in the Cold War? John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States during the climax of the Cold War. He arguably saved the human race after stopping Soviets from launching nuclear bombs. Nikita Khrushchev was a Soviet leader during the same time as Kennedy. Khrushchev also negotiated with Kennedy, but more importantly, he reformed the USSR after Stalin's death. Both leaders played a great part in the war, and if not for them, we wouldn't be here now. Spies in the Manhattan Project. During the Cold War, information was vital, since it was super important to know what the enemy was up to. Since there was not as much technology as there is now, spies were used to steal information from the other side. The most important information stolen from the US was data on the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a code name for when the Americans secretly developed nuclear arms in Los Alamos, New Mexico. People who worked on the project were recruited as spies and leaked information to the USSR. This is the only reason the Soviets were able to build nuclear bombs. Although the Americans did spy on the Russians, they did not gather as much important information. The space race. The space race was a competition between the US and USSR to see who was better in spaceflight. The Russians beat the US to putting the first object into space, the Sputnik 1, and the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. Later though, the US put the first humans on the moon in 1969, ending the space race and crowning the Americans victorious. The space race had some really positive impacts. It dramatically advanced aerospace engineering in a super short amount of time. Speaking of lasting effects, What effects does the Cold War have on our lives today? We now have a more scientifically advanced world due to heavy investment in science. NATO, a political and military alliance, was formed during the Cold War. It protects many countries from war. Communism has been destroyed. Although some nations practice it slightly, it is not the government system that is used by a big chunk of the world. And the most important, nuclear-armed nations. Now 9 nations have access to bombs powerful enough to wipe out entire cities. Before the Cold War, wars did have outcomes, but now if there is ever a major war between 2 nuclear-armed nations, it spells death for the human race. Final thoughts. The Cold War was between 2 nations who were taking a stand for what they believed in. The USA and the USSR struggled to spread their ideologies throughout the world, putting the human race in jeopardy several times. Capitalism came out on top, forming the world we know today. Without the Cold War, we wouldn't have the right to be free.